Okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sal Jarvis. Welcome to this joint Liberal Democrat Education Association and NEU hustings. We're delighted to have our two candidates here in front of us and ready to answer your questions. I am Vice Chair of the Liberal Democrat Education Association, and in my day job, I'm Deputy Vice Chancellor for Education at the University of Westminster. In a past life, I was a primary school teacher, and I'm going to hand on to Kevin, who will introduce himself and the NEU. Kevin.
Thanks, Sal. My name's Kevin Courtney, and I'm the Joint General Secretary of the National Education Union. Really pleased to be co-hosting tonight with the Lib Dem Education Association. You hopefully know that the NEU exists. We're a recent coming together of two other unions. But importantly, we're the fourth biggest union in the country, as well as the biggest education union. And we're the biggest union that isn't affiliated to any political party. So we really want good relations and to work with every political party. We come to the Lib Dem conference every year and generally have a joint fringe meeting with the LDA on some aspect of education policy. So we're really pleased to be hosting this event tonight. I'm pleased to be here with Ed and with Layla.
Thank you, Kevin. And before we move on, I would like to say thank you very much to Harjit and to Claire, who are here to be the BSL interpreters for us. We're delighted you're able to join us. Thank you so much. Okay, so we've got a fairly standard format. Both candidates are going to kick off with a 3-minute opening remarks, then we'll have some questions, and then 2 minutes closing remarks, and we're all off to the rest of our lives. So the order of speaking was decided way before we got involved. Ed is going to go first for the opening remarks and then Layla. So Ed, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Sal. Friends, education is the Liberal promise. The promise to every individual to help them make the most of their abilities so everyone can be free to be themselves. The promise of equal opportunity, so no matter your background, you get a real chance in life. But here's my radical view. In England, education is not delivering that Liberal promise. To be clear, this isn't a comment on the current shambles, on exam grades, on the Tories' multiple mistakes in handling education during the pandemic. I'd be far ruder if it were. No, I think education policy has been going wrong for some time. There are, of course, large numbers of teachers, pupils, lecturers and students hard at work who are doing well. But who really believes England's education system is delivering the Liberal promise? English education is so centralised, standardised, regularised. Is that Liberal? And even as education has become more managerial and technical, it seems less capable of equipping people for the digital world of today, let alone tomorrow. So as leader, I'd like the party in England to rethink education radically, starting with education's purpose. Conservatives and Labour compete over a technical debate around standards, imposed, top-down, rigid. I want us to start with the individual, their needs, their creativity, their choices. I want to trigger a new Liberal education debate, where yes, we equip everyone with the basic tools to learn, of reading, writing, arithmetic, but where we rethink how well-funded state education can best liberate a person's talent and foster their well-being, not crush it, as too often happens now. For me, a rethink education debate starts with the crucial early years, preschool, reception and infants, where evidence shows we have the best chance to improve the life opportunities of those from all disadvantaged backgrounds. Our party's policy to treble the pupil premium for early years is a good first step, building on that great Liberal Democrat education success. But I'd like us to be bolder. That's why, like Joe, I want the party to back universal free childcare. I want us to address also the academic and vocational divide, which stifles so many people's creativity. I want us to rethink the role of the local community and local government in education. Friends, if our party can rethink education, we will win elections on education like we used to. I'm so proud to have helped devise the penny on income tax for education campaign that played such a central role in successful elections in 92, 97 and 2001. We need to lead again on education, to cut through again on education. If we do, we will appeal to parents in their millions and win to deliver the liberal promise of education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed. And Layla.
Well, thank you, Sal. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for joining us. Education is my passion. Before I was elected to Parliament, teaching was my profession. I was a maths and physics teacher and a primary school governor. And that is why, alongside the environment and the economy, it's been the policy area right at the heart of my campaign. Like many of you, I know that schools should be centered around students, that teaching staff deserve our support to grow their skills, and that we need a fully funded education system that also enables lifelong learning. But successive governments, obsessed with testing and ineffective top-down reforms, have failed to deliver on all of these fronts. As a liberal, education is at the heart of how I think about politics. It's why I stood for Parliament. What better way is there to show what liberalism means than ensuring that all children grow up free to be who they want to be, but also free from poverty, ignorance, and conformity. But the current system, frankly, in England is broken. And coronavirus has further exposed the deep-seated inequalities that have been allowed to fester for too long. Before coronavirus, many people cared about education. Post-coronavirus, everybody cares about education. We have to seize this moment to build an education system that will need to rebuild our economy, provide opportunity for all young people, and to promote lifelong and vocational learning. And as I've long called for, this means being less reliant on exam results and more focused on teacher assessments and coursework, fairer and more representative of someone's true potential. And it also means making sure that we give children the best possible start in life. At the last election, I was proud to author the most ambitious early years offer for all major parties. And that is something we have to continue to campaign for. But I don't think that education should just be limited to the young. More and more adults choose, or indeed in this environment have to, retrain during their working life, which is why I'm also proud of our policy of lifelong learning accounts and our commitment to ensuring that further education providers get the funding they need. But unless we start winning elections, we cannot bring about these changes. And that's why I'm standing to be leader. Throughout this campaign, I have demonstrated that I can get the cut through that we need in the media to get that liberal message across, whether it's holding the government to account over COVID-19 or calling out the multiple failures of Gavin Williamson during this exam fiasco. Since mid-June, I've had over 500 positive media hits, appeared on 9 front pages, including the front page of the Daily Telegraph just this morning, quoted on BTEX ahead of the Labour spokesperson. There has never been a more important time for a revived Liberal Democrat Party, and we need to seize this moment to move our party and our country forward. I hope in this leadership election, you'll join me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both of you. Now, Sal and I have divided up the questions that have been sent up and clustered them together. So I'm going to ask a first set of those questions and then we'll go back to Sal, and we'll be alternating speakers. So Layla will go first on the first question. The questions have been themed. Sal's done the work on clustering them together, but there's one overarching question that has come in from many people. You may feel both that you've already started to answer this, but feel free to build on it. What does education mean to you? And we're going to Layla first and then to Ed.
This can mean so much, but actually, when I think of it in the context of the over 10 years I spent as a teacher, for me, it's about ensuring that every single child gets that chance to thrive, that they can leave school, that they can leave education with that sense that anything is possible, that they are valued as an individual, that they've been given every single opportunity that society has to offer, and that opportunity is available to them. And as we get older and as our economy changes and jobs are far more likely to change and flipped. This was already happening, by the way, under changes that were happening with automation and artificial intelligence. I think coronavirus has potentially accelerated some of that. The other thing that education means to me is that as an adult, we also feel that at any point we can grow, that we can thrive, that if we need to retrain, that that is possible. So at its heart, actually, at the heart of education is liberalism. It's that belief that as a person, if I empower you, you are best placed to know what to do with your life. You are best placed to make those decisions for yourself. So much of the ills we see in society right now are coming from ignorance, are coming from fake news, are coming from a lack of trust in people to understand those big complex issues. Education is the key to opportunity, and that opportunity is the key to ensuring everyone gets the most out of life.
Thanks very much, Leila. And then straight over to you, Ed. What does education mean to you?
Well, it starts with the individual, but I do want to bring in society. For the individual, it's about giving that young person, that young child, frankly, of any age, the chance to make the most of their abilities, giving them the chance to deal with things they need to know, whether it's on writing, arithmetic, digital education, and so on, or whether it's giving them choices about what they would like to study, to enable them to be as creative with their talents as they want to be. So maximizing the ability and the choices for that individual is absolutely crucial, so they can be the best person that they want to be free to be that. But I do want to bring in society, because we live in a very unequal society. There are too many people who are born with huge disadvantages, who get disadvantages. The parents may have problems, they have adverse childhood experiences. And I think the state needs to be there to help those individual children, to give them more support. You know, I do believe we fundamentally need to work for equality of opportunity. We need to make sure that, you know, people from diverse backgrounds, people from really tough starts in life, people, you know, children, looked after children, children with special education needs, that they have opportunity too. Otherwise, we can't realize the liberal promise, the liberal dream. And I don't think we fulfill education's full purpose. So it is about the individuals, but it's also about helping society move forward and progress.
Thank you very much, both of you. Now we're going on to some clusters of questions, and the first cluster, I'm going to be asking these questions. I'll ask the three of them separately, but they're all about education and the response to the pandemic. So the first of those, and we'll go first to Ed and then on to Leila, alternating as we go. So Ed and then Leila, what would you be doing differently to this government to build confidence amongst parents and school staff about a safe return to school next month?
Well, I'd first of all talk to Kirsty Williams, our amazing Liberal Democrat education minister in Wales. And her whole approach throughout the pandemic has been to talk to schools, to talk to parents, to talk to local authorities, to talk to the unions, to get people's views, present them with the scientific evidence, the challenge that she's facing from the people who are studying the pandemic and what health issues we need to take account of, share that with them, and then build a consensus. And that's why I think she's actually done far better than Gavin Williamson on so many issues throughout this COVID pandemic. And I think that's what she's doing now, to prepare young people, to prepare parents for going back to school. And you know, that's a level of consultation engagement is just so sorely lacking in England. When I've talked to head teachers in Kingston, their whole approach has always appears to be to this government, particularly during COVID, is they don't talk to us. They have surprise announcements. You know, I've had head teachers almost in tears saying, look, you know, we heard about this new government policy this morning, and 10 minutes after I heard about it, I got a phone call from a parent asking me how we were implementing it. That is not the way to build trust and relationships and partnerships. So I think if we were in power, if Liberal Democrats, Leila was our education minister in a Liberal Democrat government, you know, I think we could do no better than learning the lessons that Kirsty has shown, engaging, consulting, no surprises, and bringing a consensus about what will work when we go back to school.
Thank you. And straight over to you, Leila.
Well, Kevin, what would I do differently? Frankly, I mean, Gavin Williamson has made such an extraordinary mess of all of this that in the last week or so, I've been leading the calls to have him out. He has utterly failed at his job. We started to see the way that he was inept in this role with the easing of lockdown, bringing people back into schools. We started to see glimpses of it when we knew, and he was told that 700,000 young people don't have access to a laptop and therefore don't have access to online learning. And yet the government itself had only even planned to get out 330,000 laptops. And by the way, we've recently found out there are countless now schools that received one for entire cohorts of pupil premium students. I mean, what I wouldn't have done differently, well, what I would do now is sack him. I would absolutely sack him. He has to go. But as we look forward to September, I'll start by saying, you are right. There is a lack of trust and confidence. The Tories seem to not believe it. They seem to think that actually everyone's dying to go back to school, and actually they are, and it's conflicting emotions. I did a survey of my own community, and then asked others to spread it around parents and teachers in elsewhere in the country. And actually it's a conflicting emotion. On the one hand, people want to go back to school. They see that that social emotional development can often be stifled by students staying out of school for as long as they are. And all the teachers I talk to also want to go back to school, but they want to do so when it's safe. And the reason they don't feel it's safe, I would say, are threefold. The first is that whenever these announcements have been made, they have not been co-created. I know, Kevin, you and I and others spoke when they first released the guidance. They didn't even consult you on the detail. They should be consulting the unions. They should be consulting head teachers. They should have been consulting people on the ground who could have helped, because actually we were all on the same side and are all on the same side. The second thing that they haven't done is have a test, trace, isolate system that's actually functional. And that really is the key. They've created all these bubbles, but actually there is no trust that that system is going to work. And there is no trust in the Tories to actually deliver a system that's going to work, with Dido Harding, who mismanaged talk, when instead I'd much rather she was taken out and we brought in proper public health experts in charge of this. Test, trace, isolate isn't working, and I don't have faith it's going to be ready for September. But the third thing that they have failed to do catastrophically is that they have not communicated their own strategy towards coronavirus, towards COVID-19. Scotland has said that it's aiming for what they call zero COVID. And it's what, by the way, New Zealand has done. What you do is you can't eradicate at this stage. Eradication requires a vaccine, but you can eliminate. You can get the number of cases per million down to as low as 1. And if you do that, then whenever you see a case of flare up, it might be a school, it might be a pub in Aberdeenshire, let's say, and that's exactly what the Scottish have been aiming to do. You can then clamp down on it, and you can then control those little flare ups, and you then start to only have to firefight at the borders. And actually that's how you keep it out. And what that would do would be transformative, because those teachers and those parents and those young people who are concerned about going back to work, because they are from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, because they know that increasing evidence is mounting that even young people, if they get coronavirus, can suffer from something called long COVID, which is a long-lasting effect that we also know potentially affects students. We need a government strategy that is aiming to get to zero COVID. And that lack of strategy, I think, explains partly why we are in the mess that we are now, and why I'm sadly not of the opinion that they are going to get this right for September, and we have to.
It's sad that we're thinking like that about the possibilities for September. So the next question about the education response to the pandemic that's come in for us is, how should we assess the risk of the long-term effects of the pandemic to children and young people? And I think this is met in the wider view of what the risks are. What should we do if these aren't known, and what level of risk is acceptable for children and young people for whom we're providing education? And that's first to Leila and then to Ed.
Thank you. Well, when I hear this, I hear actually there's sort of two sides to this risk. One is the medical risk that I was just talking about. We are increasingly hearing of very young children potentially being affected by things like long COVID, and it is debilitating. In these cases, what you find are young adults, children who get it, relatively mild symptoms, but then they don't shake it off, this long-lasting fatigue. And I'm genuinely worried about how big this could be because the research hasn't been done. So the first thing we need to do is ensure that we are trying to measure this, that we actually call it what it is, which is actually a new condition, and that the research is being funded by government to understand it. And that's not happening yet. And we are calling for government to do this as part of the coronavirus APPG. I'm leading an inquiry into coronavirus all the way through recess, and this is one of the things that we've been asking them to do. But there is another risk, a broader risk, and it's one that has really, really concerned me. From the minute that we locked down, I thought, what about the vulnerable children? What about those who social services know about, but actually what has been keeping me up at night is thinking about those who social services don't yet know about. We know that if a child is growing up in a home where there is domestic abuse, they are far more likely to end up dropping out of school later on, that trauma that they face from a very young age carries with them into their adulthood. And I've been deeply, deeply worried about this. And so right at the very beginning, this was my focus. I was writing to education ministers, making the call for them to recruit into schools the extra teachers that they need. We know that schools have had a decimation of teaching assistants, that actually a lot of the teachers were spending their time following students up, checking that they were okay, delivering food parcels to their house. They were the ones doing it. And actually what we needed was a much broader workforce working with children and their families to make sure that if we could find these vulnerable children, we caught them before they started to fall. And this is still an issue. It's an ongoing issue. It's one that I know many of the councillors who will be watching today will be very, very aware of. And it's one that I'm not convinced that the government has totally got to grips with. The answer is more resourcing being put into not just schools, but actually all those support services around schools, children's centres, youth workers, social services, all of that needs to be in there. And alongside it, a strong support on mental health. And that's a very quick thing I'll say, and I know I've gone on a little because there is a lot here. But the last thing I'm really worried about is young people's mental health. They've done surveys that show that they are deeply concerned about this. Actually, some of them may well end up suffering from forms of PTSD as a result of the traumas of not just what they might be facing at home, and even while many will be safe, the separation from their friends, their worry about the futures in front of them. We need to make sure that mental health services are well serviced and that they have the capacity to be able to deal with the potential fallout of this pandemic.
Thanks, Leila. You're right. There's so much to say on all these questions.
Sorry.
We've got a lot of questions we want to get through. That's absolutely fine. We are in your hands. So, Ed, the question is about the effects. How do we assess the risks of the long-term effects of pandemic on our young people in that wider sense, and what level of risk is acceptable?
Well, I think we have to do a huge amount of research and study and engagement with schools and the health service and other professionals to really get these risks assessed really quickly. I was very impressed again by Kirsty Williams' approach. The reason why she wanted, and it was only in Wales that it happened, to get all year groups back to school before the summer holidays was so that they could all be discussed and talked to with their teachers, and the teacher could find out how they were and what sort of situation they were in with their education, but also their well-being. And Kirsty was absolutely right, because until the teachers can see the young people and give an assessment of them, particularly the younger children, then they don't quite know what they're dealing with. So the approach that Kirsty had was absolutely right. Get all of them back before the summer recess. But we are where we are with everywhere else. So what are the priorities? I would start with mental health and psychological issues. I think this is going to affect the vast of quite a large number. Bear in mind, children with mental health issues before are likely to have had them seriously exacerbated. But there may be some children, young people, where they've got new concerns and new worries. Let's face it, COVID has been quite a stressful thing. People worrying about, will they get it? Will their parents get it? Will their friends get it? They may well have had loss. They may well have had parents or friends or relatives who've died, and there's that bereavement angle to this as well. So I think that mental psychological piece is a bit we've really got to focus on rapidly, and make sure that schools have the outside experts coming in to advise them, to help them to do both the pastoral care and that diagnosis. Because we all know with mental health, early intervention is so critical. So that would be my top priority. Then I agree with Layla very much about those children who were already at risk from abuse from their parents in one way or other. You know, children whose parents got mental health problems themselves, who've got drug or alcohol problems, who have just abused their children. And we know from the social service risk register, you know, many of these families. And while the government was right to say those children could go to the schools during the lockdown, all the evidence from counsellor after counsellor who I spoke to during those first 3 or 4 months was that those children weren't actually turning up at school. The parents weren't bringing them. That really shouldn't have been a surprise. And when I talked to our local social services and children's services about what they were doing, they were saying they were reaching out. They were not just making telephone calls, but they were going and knocking on doors and checking up on the children very proactively. Now, I don't know if that happened in every local authority and whether or not that proactive work was successful, but that's going to be a really key issue, because some children may well have had some really bad experiences, and clearly we need to identify those as well. I just add in finishing, I think we've got to think about those students at FE colleges. We've got to think about the students at HE, because you know they will have had stressful times too, worrying about exams. We all seen too clearly, worrying about the government's mess of it, but also that any transition period from school to college, from school to university, has stresses of its own. And I think, you know, we've talked about separately from COVID the need for a student mental health charter. I think we do need to make sure that it's not just the school children, vital though they are, it's those slightly older children we should worry about too.
Well, thank you very much, both of you. There's one last question in this section about the education response to the pandemic. We'll be coming first to Ed. You might be able to answer this in a succinct way if you want to. It's up to you. The schools minister marked the government's performance on exam grading this summer with an A-. What grade would you give the government for the way they have handled exam grading in England?
Kevin, I didn't know that. I can't believe he had the audacity to do that. I mean, it's a U, isn't it? I mean, is that the worst mark you can get? I mean, frankly, this is the most appallingly incompetent government on so many levels, but they even surpassed themselves. And the fact that Gavin Williamson hasn't gone is just beyond belief.
Thank you. And Layla?
Fail. Fail.
Good. We've saved some time on that question with those succinct answers. Thank you very much. And I'm over to Sal.
Thanks a lot. Okay, that was great, that last one. Thank you to whoever sent it in as well. So cluster 2 is about inclusion. So there's 4 questions on various aspects of that. I should have remembered who I'm coming. I think I'm coming to Layla. I'm coming to you first, aren't I? Because Ed started last time. So the first one is this. During the coalition, Vince pushed through some changes to disabled students allowance, which have made it more difficult for disabled students to go to university. They have to fight for reasonable adjustments and can't always afford to continue their higher education. What would you do to ensure that university can be for disabled students so that the professions can start to represent society?
Yeah, excellent question. And I've been calling for a reversal of that. We actually need much higher allowances for disabled students. Issues, in fact, in my own constituency that I've helped with are students who've contacted me saying that there's actually a bit of a lottery depending on which universities they go to as to whether they're able to top up the amount that they get to be able to buy the laptop that they need, or actually in the case of some, if they need to make adjustments to, they need to buy things to change their accommodation, whatever it is that they may need, that's what that money is meant to go towards. And actually, I think that needs to be reversed. But in terms of what we need to do moving forward, actually, I think we need to be reinstating maintenance grants in general. And we need to be much more generous with that, because whilst we know what happened with tuition fees and our party and coalition, we've lost a huge amount of trust with young people. I think there was a poll that was done yesterday that showed that, in fact, with young people, the Greens are now outpolling the Lib Dems. We're bottom of the progressive parties, and that is a reversal of where we were before coalition. We have to recognise that if we're going to win back the trust of young voters, we have to have things that we say to them that make them understand that we are on their side. And when I then look to, well, what is the answer to fixing this? Actually, I don't think going back to no tuition fees at all is the right policy. We need to support our universities, especially now. I wouldn't want to start imposing caps on the number of students who go to universities. But when I speak to young people about this, what they say to me is the biggest barrier that they have to getting to university in the first place, especially if they're from a disadvantaged background, isn't just that sort of prospect of the debt. So I do think we should be moving to a graduate tax, but it's also the immediate living costs of getting to universities in the first place. And we should be bringing back those maintenance grants that were also cut at the same time. As it happens, it's what's happened in Wales, and it's had a really positive effect. I'd like to see that come in England as well.
Thank you, Layla. Ed?
I think the question was about disabled students and a change that major in the coalition that have hurt them and prevented them many going to university. Those clearly need to be reversed, but I'd like to do far more than that. I'd like to see what else we need to do to make sure that disabled young people have equal opportunity. I'm the patron of a charity called Disability Law Service, and we've done a lot of work on education, particularly looking at how some local authorities have broken the law with respect to assessments for autistic children, for example. And we have a program looking at how disabled young people are not getting their rights met. And I want to make sure that we start off from a presumption that anybody who can pass those exams, get those right assessments, get that right accreditation, that they have the chance to go to FE and HE. And there are no barriers to them, whatever their abilities, their physical abilities. So I really think this needs a proper overview. Yes, let's reinstate things that were taken away, but what else can we do to make sure that they really have that accessibility? And let's face it, every institution in FE and HE needs to be looking at its policies, looking at its buildings, looking at its lecture theatres, etc., etc. Are they going far enough to make sure that inclusion agenda in their institution is a genuine one? And I think they need to, of course, they're independent institutions, but they need to get support in doing that, but need to be held account for doing that.
Thank you very much, Ed. Okay, so the second question in this cluster is thinking about lifelong learning opportunities. It's how will you address the current and emerging skills shortages and ensure that lifelong learning opportunities are available for everyone? And Ed, you're first, and then Layla.
Well, I first of all want to take some advice on this because it's not an area that I'm absolutely got over all the detail. I'd like to be clear about where the challenges are, where the barriers are to people retraining, reskilling, changing their career. Clearly, we've got policies on it. We had the training wallet, we called it, £10,000 in the last election. I've seen other approaches to lifelong learning. We've got, people in the past have had learning skills accounts, ideas about being able to draw down part of your pension early to help you be able to pay for that. There's a whole range of ideas, and I'd like to have that as part of that education debate that I talked about before. I'd like to add in one other thing though, as we talk about retraining for the future. I want to make sure that's taking account of the genuine new shape of the economy, because it's going to be a green economy, it's going to be a low carbon economy. That's going to need different skills, different approaches, and post-COVID, we may have another different restructuring. We may not all be working, or fewer people will be working in offices, let's face it. So let's make sure that when we're doing that analysis and thinking afresh, that we're taking into account the future shape of society and the economy. Final thing I'd like to add in, I think we forget and undervalue adult education. Now, I'm fed up of people saying adult education is just middle class education. That's not my experience. Moreover, I've seen adult education, community education be fantastic for people's health, for being a bridge from not working to working. And I think as a party, we ought to champion adult education in the community far more than we've done in recent years.
Thank you very much, Ed. Layla.
Well, this lifelong learning agenda, I actually think now its time is coming. And it's not coming for the reasons that we wanted it to come. We thought always as a party have spoken about education being available to anyone at any point. If you want to retrain, if you want to have a hobby, you should always be supported in that. It helps your mental health and well-being. It's also great for fostering creativity and entrepreneurship, and it's all good stuff. It's good liberal stuff. But actually there is a practical reason why we need to ensure that our lifelong learning objectives are met right now. We are in a 1 in 300 year recession. We are potentially facing a Margaret Thatcher-esque level of unemployment that could happen as soon as next year. And we have to ensure that people don't fall through the cracks and are left there. We have to have a system that catches them, that encourages them to use time on furlough, to spend the time that they may have because their sector is going under, to actually think and have the skills to be able to then move into something else. And I think it first starts with lifelong learning accounts. By the way, I don't like the name skills wallets. I remember saying it during the general election. I think we should jettison that. But the approach of that, which is to give every person bags of money at different points in their life so that they can spend it on what they want to retrain, I think is a brilliant idea. And what it also addressed was some of the supply side issues that we were seeing in the sector. With the changes to tuition fees that were made, actually the cost came to people like the Open University. I'm a huge fan of the Open University, and yet that has really struggled in the last few years. And actually I would like to see that reversed. But the sector that has done really, really poorly since 2010 is the RFE sector. They've had 12% less funding. And I think we need to start by refunding FE, by ensuring that there are high quality courses out there available to all that people can access at any point, whether it be by distance or whether it be at night or whatever it might be, so that they can then make that next leap and have the skills to be able to do it. And the very final thing, which doesn't get mentioned enough, I think, and this was a key plank of our lifelong learning accounts policy, is that it's not just about the money, it's also about careers advice. And that careers advice, which is often very poorly delivered in schools at the moment, not the fault of the school, the fault of the lack of resourcing towards it in schools, needs to now also be freely available to everyone at any stage of life. Because unfortunately, coronavirus is going to mean sectors up and down the UK, across all ages, are going to now face the issues of how am I going to retrain? How am I going to get into this other industry? Maybe it was a leap they always wanted to take, and this is the chance for them to do it, if you want to see it in a positive way. But careers advice is going to be a critical part of all of this change.
Thank you very much, Layla. Okay, so next question, we're starting with you and then on to Ed. And this question's about child poverty. So before the pandemic even hit, there were 4.1 million children in the country trapped in poverty. And the IFS were predicting that a further 1.1 million children would be in poverty by 2022. So, do you agree that it should be the job of government to develop and deliver an ambitious and credible child poverty reduction strategy?
Without a doubt, yes. And the reason why this matters, and actually this speaks right to the heart of why I got into politics at all. I was very happily a maths and physics teacher for a long while. I did physics at Imperial. I started teaching, and a few years into my career, I then did a master's in comparative education at the Institute of Education. And I realized, and it really made me quite angry actually, I'd lived in countries like Ethiopia when I was younger. They have an excuse. You know, they were war-torn, they had famines, they had huge educational inequality. And yet when you come to this G7 country, we have absolutely no excuse for any child to go to bed hungry. And yet that has always happened. And that deep-seated inequality actually ended up being a better predictor of where you would end up educationally than anything else. There are other countries, by the way, that don't have this. The UK is up there with the US in having that deep-seated, deep-rooted inequality. It's why I got into politics. It's why I'm a Lib Dem, because I know that we care deeply about this. And so we have to find strategies to tackle it. And it starts by realizing that actually the inequalities that we see in school are part of wider inequalities we see in society. And coronavirus is just making them worse. It's the bottom 20% that are going to be the worst affected by this. It's those most precarious in the job market, those who are in work poverty. That is the biggest cohort of children, by the way, who are living in poverty, are living in households that are in work poverty. Tackling the welfare system and universal credit that does not work is one of the ways that we should do this. It's why I've been an advocate, especially now, for a universal basic income, because that would be one way to help to support those families, a much easier system to navigate. But I've also been calling for much more money to go into child benefit as well. And that at every opportunity that we see a young person that's struggling, the answer has to be help the family, help that child, make sure that they've got food on the table. That's why I've been calling for free school meals to be extended, not just over this period, and I was so happy they were. Thank goodness for Marcus Rashford to introduce a bit of common sense to that debate. But actually, we should never allow any child in this country, this rich country, to go to bed hungry. Because if we do that, it is a failing and an indictment on all of us and the whole of society. And I think it should be a priority for us as a party.
Thank you, Leila. Ed.
Absolutely, it should be a top priority. I've been talking about a fairer society. You can't have a fairer society if you've got such high levels of child poverty. The question is, how do you deal with it? And why is it been rising? Well, first of all, the increasing unemployment, not just people who were employees, but a loss of income and a loss of work for people who are self-employed, really a big part of the problem, actually. Also low pay, and also the way our benefit structure works. So work, pay, and benefits is where I'd start. And on work, we need to have a really ambitious agenda for creating new jobs. Whether it's working with the SME sector and small businesses, helping the self-employed, where job creation can be fastest, whether it's in parts of the public sector, whether it's parts of the green economy I've talked a lot about. I think there's a lot of job creation there that the government can really support, and that would have a big impact. But we also need to look at pay, whether it's in the insecure jobs in the gig economy, where we've really got to clamp down, whether it's pay in many other sectors. Now, the government may have the national living wage, but often that isn't implemented. Often it isn't properly regulated with. So we need to make sure the inspectorate is there, calling out employers that haven't actually delivered on that. I mean, I remember when I was cabinet minister, I was the only cabinet minister who required in his department there to be the London living wage paid. It wasn't to the civil servants, by the way, it was to the cleaners, the security guards, and the caterers. And it made a big difference to them and their families. And rather having a high turnover of staff, we suddenly kept people because they're actually being paid properly. So pay is definitely an issue. And let's go to benefits. And like Leila, I'm in favor of a universal basic income, but to be honest, that wouldn't have much effect on this issue immediately. And one's got to look at the benefit system where you can have the biggest impact. And first of all, you'd have to do some emergency reforms to universal credit. And one of the big iniquities of universal credit, which isn't talked about, which is a big impact on child poverty actually, is the fact that the premiums for children only go for your first two children. If you have 3, 4, or 5 children, you don't get any extra through universal credit. That has to be changed. And when I was costing our manifesto the last election, and when it was analysed by the IFS, by the Resolution Foundation, our commitment to that policy made our policies more progressive and took more children out of poverty because we were ready very quickly to look at that issue. There are others one could talk about, but one needs to make sure you're really getting that money to those families who are struggling as quickly as possible, so they have that money to go out of child poverty. Final thing is housing. Now, the real problem with housing, of course, is the cost for so many people. the cost in private rented in particular. And if you look at people in work poverty, it's partly wages, it's partly the high cost of housing. And we've got to do something about that. That's not an easy solution, by the way, but if you're serious about having a fairer society, you're serious about tackling child poverty, you've also got to have solutions for housing. And I'm particularly keen actually on a big expansion of council housing. That might sound, you might be surprised at that, but I've long advocated an increase in council housing. I'm married to a lady who is a councillor in Kingston, and she's got the housing portfolio and she's building a lot of council houses. So I know it can be done, and I know it has a big impact on poverty.
Thank you very much, Ed. Okay, so the last question in this cluster, I'm going to ask both of you to be succinct with it, because I think some of the things that you've already talked about in this cluster are part of the answer to this question. So if you can kind of pull out the key bits, that would be great. It is how, in addition to youth services, can society do more to help those not achieving their educational potential rather than leaving it all to teachers? So Ed, I'm starting with you, and then on to Layla.
So if I understand the question, you were not allowed to talk about teachers at school or FE colleges or youth services. What else can we do? Well, I genuinely believe there's an awful lot that you can do with respect to the local community being stronger. All those aspects of community, whether it's youth clubs or whether it's youth organizations outside the formal youth service, they can have a really massive impact. And I also think that ensuring parents and ensuring extended families have the ability to support their youngsters. There's no doubt, if you look at certainly in my 20 years as a constituency MP, children whose parents and young people whose parents hadn't got the skills and the ability to support them, those children were more likely to have problems. And sometimes it's not so much that the parents aren't well educated and aren't articulate, it's that the child have particular problems. They may have some special needs, some disability which affects their behavior, and you can't expect everyone to understand how to deal with that. So I think there is a way of trying to see if we can empower families with the knowledge of how to deal with children who have missed out in some way for some reason.
Thank you very much. Layla.
Thank you, Sal. And yes, while we've alluded to some of it, actually, again, it's a massive area, but I'll try and be succinct. I mean, youth services are really important. And I'm really proud that as a party at the last election, we were talking about putting £500 million back into youth services. They do an incredible job. But actually, the decimation of youth services came alongside the decimation of a lot of the other support networks that were around families. And I know very well, a school can't fix everything, much as they may want to, much as every single teacher in that school and everyone who's trying to support that child knows that actually, if only that family would just get the support that they needed, that child would do better. But the decimation of the cuts made as part of austerity to local authority budgets more generally has caused an enormous issue. We've also seen Sure Starts disappear. I want to see them come back. That investment in early years was one of the most expensive parts of the last manifesto. And it meant that not just we would have high quality people helping those families, signposting those families to the support that they needed. You also had an investment in the social and emotional development of children at that age, which then has a lasting impact as they get older. And I was doing some work during coronavirus and also before on knife crime, on exclusions, those children who fall through the cracks of the education system, an education system that, by the way, is far too narrow, that really doesn't nurture that individual, doesn't focus on well-being. That social and emotional development is just as important as the intellectual development of a young person. And the shocking stat that I heard from this pupil referral unit that I was speaking with in Sutton was that 90% of the young people that they work with had suffered or witnessed abuse in the home at an early age before. So that's what I mean by those services around the family, the social services, the ability to be able to access and signpost, very often women, but not always, towards those people who can help, and the decimation of mental health services. One of the areas that Norman Lamb and others have really championed as part of our party, we need to continue to do so. If we don't invest in children and their families, the whole of those families as part of a wider community, then it's no wonder that we see those young people fall through the cracks in the way that we are.
Thanks very much, Leila. Okay, I'm handing the baton to Kevin now.
And thank you both for those answers. I've got 3 questions, 1 on school accountability and 2 on education funding. So going to Leila first of all on the accountability question, and then to Ed. Leila, as you know, school league tables and routine Ofsted inspections were suspended this year, maybe because of a fairly general realization that they would be unfair and unuseful. What do you think should happen in the coming school year?
Thanks, Kevin. Well, in the book Build Back Better that I pulled together and edited, and we brought together voices from across the party looking at what the world would look like after coronavirus. I was in the education chapter that I authored looking at how we could do things differently in our education system and what opportunities coronavirus might actually present us so that we can start to do things differently. Now, it's been policy since I became education spokesperson to scrap and replace Ofsted. It's been broken for a long time. It has encouraged a system where we essentially reduce children to numbers. That is not how most people see students. That's not how students see themselves. And we had a punishing system instead of one that naturally helped schools to help each other, that nurtured innovation, and that really drove positive improvement. And I'm really proud of that. And league tables, again, as part of that policy that I helped to author and drive through conference, was to scrap league tables as well, because they are very often misleading. And that average number that you get for a school actually has very little bearing on what that means for your child. And that's actually what most parents want to know. We need accountability systems. We need to ensure that schools are held to account, but also we have to help them improve. And at the moment, the system is failing to do both. And this year, it would have been particularly unfair. Not just because the government had essentially created an algorithm initially that was amounting to grading by postcode, because that's what it was doing. It was disproportionately downgrading students from poorer backgrounds. It was disproportionately downgrading students in the north. There was something terribly wrong with this algorithm. It beggars belief, by the way, that apparently the education ministers didn't even ask to see it. And when they did, it was just about a week ago. Utter incompetence, but I won't go down that road for now. What I think will happen next year is we need to use this opportunity to show that actually there are other ways that you can do accountability in schools. It's made the case, I think, going back to centre assessed grades, there's a general sense right now that we should trust teachers, that teachers know them better than a random system. And yes, the algorithm was wrong, but actually there were deep-seated issues in the system. Now is the time to make the case for a different education system. And when I first became a parliamentarian, I started a commission, which in fact, thank you, Kevin, for sitting on it, and you've been part of it. And the idea behind it was to bring together unions, to bring together industry, to bring together academics, to change that debate around education. And in fact, the recommendations from it are going to come in September. And the idea was to actually change the system from within, using voices that are initially non-political and then bring it into the political debate, that actually exams aren't everything, that we want children to be world ready, not just exam ready, and that these accountability systems run counter to what it is that we are trying to do. So it's a big aim. It's one that has been 3 years in gestation, and we're on the cusp of some really interesting results coming from that particular commission. So I'm actually quite excited about what the future will hold in terms of this debate.
Thanks, Leila, and over to you, Ed.
So I think there does need to be a big debate about education. That's what I said in my opening remarks, because accountability is important in all walks of life. If people are entrusted with our children and young people, whether entrusted with a lot of money, then of course they need to be held accountable. But the question is, accountable for what? Which begs the question, what are we trying to do with education? And my concern about our whole education system is that it is centralized, national, regularized, rigid, when people aren't, when people are different. And if you really embrace, and got rid of the vocational academic divide, for example, and gave a real choice to young people, enable that creativity, and you have different types of school which were suited different types of children, that sort of centralized accountability just won't make sense. So I wouldn't prejudge the education debate that I'd like to trigger, but the idea that that debate can be held account by one national regulator with one approach, that will come out of it, just for the birds. The reality is, in my vision of what this debate would produce, you'd have different types of schools such that they would therefore have to be judged on the excellence that they were providing within that school. And you would find different approaches. So you'd find sampling, you'd find Ofsted, or whatever one would call it, going in there to assist them and support and nurture, rather than going there to try to fail. So you'd have a very different approach to education. That may not help you, Kevin, in what's going to happen next term with Ofsted, next year with Ofsted. But I think here in this debate within the leadership, we're talking about the future of education. And in that context, I would see accountability operating in quite a different way.
Okay, thank you both. And like I said, 2 questions on funding. So coming first of all to Ed. Last summer, Ed, the government promised £7.1 billion increase in the revenue over the next 3 years for schools, and that's welcome. But the school cuts campaign that the NEU is part of says it falls well short of 12.6 billion needed to replace cuts since 2015, let alone providing a world-class education. And that campaign also says that 83% of schools are still worse off now in real terms than they were in 2015. So would a government that you led prioritise reversing these cuts to education funding? Yes,
absolutely. And the manifesto that we stood on just last December did that. That is our policy. It remains our policy. And we found the money in our costed budget, which I was in charge of costing. So it has to be a priority. Indeed, over my career in the Liberal Democrats, I've been one of the people who've argued for more money for education. I said it in my opening remarks. I helped create that policy of a penny on income tax for education, when raising taxes, you seemed as you were crazy to do that. But I think we first announced that in 1990 or 1991, and it was a very powerful message in 1992 election, but particularly came of age in 97 and 2001, when the party had massive breakthroughs. And we were seen back then as the party of education because we'd made that bold, radical commitment. And I'd like us to go back to that sort of radical approach to education funding and be making it clear that that's the priority we put on it.
Thank you. And to you, Leila.
Thank you, Kevin. In short, yes, absolutely. Actually, I think we should be going back to 2010 levels. One of the things we did do in coalition was hold that budget steady, but actually it was steady but before inflation. And so there was a bit of eating away that happened then, and then the majority of these cuts did happen after 2015. And what it has meant, bluntly, is that any slack that was in the system that we had before, to be able to, for example, if you don't have, and this is a particular issue in small rural schools, classes that are very easy to manage. You can't, if you've got 1 or 2 kids over or under, and then you've got maximum class sizes, you then have to split the class, and then you've got money that you can't sort of recoup. You don't, that money per child formula, where you've got that sort of baseline and then what you add on top, it doesn't work. And the Tories talk about sort of a fair funding formula. but actually there was always inbuilt inequality into that system, and it's never really been something that they've addressed, even under the current formula. So I do think that we need to be going back to higher levels of funding, and under this pandemic right now, we are still seeing this crisis, because what happened with the major cuts that happened, and I was actually a school governor, and we were looking at budgets. It was teaching assistants that had to go. Over the last few years, 4 years, we've had 2 major reorganizations of the school, which is essentially a way of saying, asking teachers to do more with less teachers, and having less TAs to be able to support them. TAs have been asked to do more. It's primarily hit staffing, but it's also hit the capital budget. There's a huge black hole in the capital budget for schools. We now have schools that are not fit for purpose. The Tories are claiming that they have helped to fix some of this, but actually they haven't. The amount of money that was needed for that was also far, far short. And you ended up with schools that have now just don't have windows that work, that don't have roofs that keep the rain out. It's utterly, utterly atrocious the way that our school estate has not kept pace with funding as well. So it needs to be both, and it's going to take much, much more than 7.1 billion. And that even comes before we want to give teachers the pay rise that they deserve. It's not all about money, but money does help.
Thank you both. My final question and comes first to Leila. The Auger review considered funding of education post-16. How would a government that you led balance funding between higher and further education?
Thank you. Well, first of all, there were elements of the Auger review that I thought were very good, particularly what it was saying about the FE sector. It made a good job of making the case of why we need to refund the FE sector, which is what I was saying before. I've supported our Save Our Colleges campaign, and the point about that campaign is that teachers who work in colleges aren't paid the same as teachers who work in schools. It's utterly, utterly unfair and unacceptable, because it's colleges that are very often the places where those students who actually just don't like that very academic, narrow way that we approach GCSEs, the way that we've narrowed to Progress 8. We've seen a lot of creative subjects eaten out of the curriculum. I'm always been talking about, even though I'm a maths and science teacher, it's not just about STEM, it's about STEAM. The arts are really important too. And it's often the FE colleges that manage to reignite those students, and where those vocational subjects end up allowing those students to see that, yes, they may not have been good at the traditional 50s way of doing education, they're actually better at other things. So we need to follow through on that. And in the last manifesto that we had, I made sure that there was parity of funding for FE colleges to mainstream schools, which I think is really important. But the question was also about higher education. And that balance is also about recognizing that 50% of people don't go on to university. And actually, they shouldn't have to if they don't want to. There needs to be a much better integration between the academic and the vocational. And it's not about being smart or not, which is often how it's presented. Medicine, you know, the smartest of them all go on to do medicine, right? That's a vocational subject. And the way that the best classes are taught are very often about weaving those two things together. Part of the rethink of how we do the curriculum, a much broader curriculum. I think it shouldn't just be limited to numbers of different subjects. I've always been an advocate in my own classes as well of being much more practical, of making students see why it's important that they're learning what they're learning. Who better to teach maths to a higher level than the most creative of students? They're far more likely to start their own businesses and be the entrepreneurs of the future. So I think we fundamentally need to rethink that relationship between vocational and academic, the one for the smart people, the one for the people good with their hands, and actually start to integrate those much, much better, with less emphasis perhaps on the end goal being university. To university funding, I think I've answered that in a previous question, so I won't go there, but it's more about the attitude that I think we need to bring to both parts that currently are separated and shouldn't be.
Thanks, Leila, and straight over to you, Ed.
You know, I think if you reread the Auger review now, you'd say it's totally out of date. COVID has changed the finances of so much of our society, particularly colleges and universities. And when they're thinking about having COVID secure lessons, when they're thinking about the increased numbers, when they're thinking about how they're going to play a role in a society where we may have higher unemployment, where we've got changes, skills and new changes in the economy. I've talked about the green economy, for example. You know, we're going to need a very different approach to working out how much we fund, but it's clearly going to have to be a bigger amount than is currently planned. I am deeply alarmed that some of our universities are in dire straits. I'm deeply alarmed that even some of the ones that were financially okay before COVID are really struggling now. And if you look at our FE colleges, which are so important, and I want to talk a little bit about that, I haven't seen the latest figures on how they're coping, but we're going to need, I would imagine, like to see the evidence, but I would imagine more places at FE colleges too. And for me, that's really important, because the thing about FE is they often, many further education colleges are often teaching adults who are trying to retrain, but they're also teaching young people who have missed out. The young people who didn't want the sort of school environment, weren't so academically inclined. That, I know that's a caricature of some colleges. Some colleges got very strong academic records, but nevertheless, I think it's relative. I think it is true to say that FE plays a real role in creating greater social justice in the education system and therefore in society more broadly. So I really, really think we need to invest in FE. I don't know what the impact on FE will be of the government lifting the cap on university places. I'll be interested to see some analysis of that. So I guess overall, Kevin, my answer is that Augur is probably out of date. We need to look at it again. We need to look at it in the light of the COVID and the economic challenges. And I think we've got to seriously invest in FE and HE.
Thank you both. And I'm back over to Sal.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Okay, so I've got one question on campaigning and then a couple of questions on assessment and exams. So my question on campaigning is, so how do we persuade parents, employers, the general public to support our ideas for education? And in particular, what should we be doing in the local elections to persuade people towards our ideas for education and what's relevant about it?
To me, Liz? Sal, to me? Or to
Yeah, sorry, to you. I should have said that. I was getting used to the back. And yes, you finish, so you start. So yes, to you, and then Lola.
Well, I think we need to look when we've had messages that have cut through before, because we haven't had for a while. I mean, I've talked about the penny on income tax for education. I think when we talked about smaller class sizes, that cut through. There may be other examples of messages that cut through. We may need to look at what's cut through in other countries and for other parties. As long as we have messages that we are absolutely convinced have our policies, we can afford them, and so on, we should try to get one or two, probably no more, and stick to those messages and drum them through. You know, I remember the campaigns on the penny income tax. It was a fabulous campaign. People got it. They understood it. Even if they didn't like it, by the way, they said it was a Liberal Democrat policy because it was spiky. And you know, one thing I've got really worried about in our campaigning in recent years is we've become too mushy. By which I mean, we've had policies which, frankly, the other parties could take. They weren't that distinctive, and that's not going to cut through. And I don't, you know, I'm in the Liberal Democrats for a reason. I'm a radical. I want to reform things, and I don't want mushy policies. I want things that people say, that's the Liberal Democrat approach. It's different. I think the smaller class sizes, it wasn't as distinctive as a penny income tax for education because Labour was talking about it, but it did talk to parents. And let's remember that the parents are huge, millions of them, and we've got to make sure the policies resonate with them. They're thinking of their child, right? You know, will this help my child? And if the policy says to them, yeah, my child will get more of the teacher's time, or my child will benefit in this way, they're more likely to back it. So, it's not rocket science. When you're trying to push forward a policy, is it distinctive? Will it cut through? Will people get it and associate it with you? And will they see it as benefiting them, or their family, their child, their young person? And those are the ways you've got to form the campaigning messages. And when you look at the whole panoply of education policies, of which we have many, as in many areas, you're not going to put those into campaigning, are you? You're going to pick one or two that have these cut through and are popular. And I would like us to assess all of them that we've got at the moment through that lens, because I don't think we've been doing that in recent times.
Thank you very much. Layla?
Well, the key thing that in my view, we haven't been doing enough. And when I say we, I just want to make a distinction for a moment, because actually I think councillors and local parties and local campaigners do this much better than Westminster and HQ right now. And that's to listen to voters. And it's all very well having, great lofty policies where we, and, in the context of this hustings, yes, let's talk about which type of liberal are you? And let's talk about the minutiae of different parts of policies. But when you're campaigning, the key thing about campaigning is that you meet the voter where they are. And that, broadly speaking, those voters, especially in local elections, are looking at their local school. They're looking at what are the issues that affect them there. And what I kept hearing, and I've done 300 meetings with 300 local parties, and this is, I think, our 49th husting or something like that. Every single time this kind of thing has come up, local parties are saying the messages that are coming out of the leader and the messages that are coming out of HQ often run counter to what we know really resonates with our voters on the ground. So it starts by listening, and it starts by living our values in devolving that campaign message to local parties to be able to then use those messages in a way that really connects with voters. So if, for example, locally, you have a school that is really struggling financially, and this is why the school cuts campaign was so good. And I really credit the NEU with driving that. And we very much worked with the NEU to reinforce the messages with quite a lot of coordination, because actually by using those outside forces and being part of that bigger movement, that's how you will often make sure that those voters get that message as well. And the reason why the school cuts campaign was so good was because it spoke to both to teachers and parents and also students, who could all of them see the effect of what was going on with the school cuts before their very eyes. I think that has waned somewhat. Some of the words coming out of government over the last few years, I think, have made people think that they're better education. But the fiasco that we have now seen over A-levels, over GCSEs, what on earth has happened to BTECs? They have been pulled at the last minute. This issue is going to rumble on and on and on. And so I would encourage local parties to look at what are those stories that you've got locally? What are those businesses locally who now perhaps are struggling because there aren't the students coming out of the local FE college that have the skills that they need? Whatever it is, there is going to be localization to this. You ask them, I will ask them with you, what is it that they care about? And then that's going to help us lead into that message of what we're going to take into next year's very important May 2021 elections.
Thank you very much, Layla. Okay, so now we've got 2 more questions, but we're beginning to run out of time. So I'm going to set you a challenge. I'm going to do the questions, and with each question, you each only get 2 sentences, not 2 minutes, 2 sentences. Okay.
How many colons?
Don't make them too long. In education, we want to focus on having succinct questions, clear sentences. So the first one of those is, and Layla, I'm starting with you this time and then going to Ed to be clear. Do you support the NEU's call for a review into the nature and type of assessment done in school to ensure that results are a fair reflection of students' ability and not their background? So yes or no, and 2 sentences.
Yes. That's the first sentence, I suppose. And the reason why, comma, is because I agree that there is a problem with this, and it's already part of our party's policy, some of it, but we need to do a review because, as we now see, there is still a problem, especially with coronavirus, and it does need fixing.
Thank you. Very good. Ed.
First sentence, yes. Second sentence, yes.
Right. Thank you very much, Ed. Okay, question 2, starting with you, Ed, this time. So this is about SATs and other tests. As a leader, would you support the growing number of parents, heads and teachers who are saying that the SATs, phonics check and times table check should not go ahead in 2020? And do you agree that children are more than a score? Now, clearly there's the opportunity for 2 one-word sentences that, but you do get 2 whole sentences as well if you want, Ed. Off you go.
Well, I think my answer is probably, first is probably, and next one is yes. I say probably because I don't know enough about it. I'm very happy for people to come and tell me more about it. But I don't think I should commit absolutely to something I'm not sure on because I haven't read or know enough about it. So I'm going to have to sit on the fence a little bit, but it's probably. Second one is yes.
Thank you very much. And Layla.
Well, scrapping SATs is already party policy. I was very proud to lead that through conference. And so I'm proud to continue to support that. I also support more than a score and their calls to stop the phonics tests. I also want to see the scrapping of the baseline test.
Thank you. I think that was 2 questions, two sentences as well. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to hand back over to Kevin now for the closing question, your closing remarks and the farewell. So Kevin, over to you.
Yeah, so there's one more question and then we're going to ask you to do 2 minutes each. And are we in the right sequence? Anyway, the final question, you may have been expecting this or not, and it's to Ed first. Who was your favourite teacher and why? Oh, is it Ed first? Yes, it is Ed first.
Arthur Sparrow. He taught me history A level and he taught me how to think.
Good. Layla.
I loved a lot of my teachers, but one who is still in my life was a man called Andrew England. He's in fact, I discovered later, a member in Brighton, and he was my chemistry teacher. And he presided over my favorite lesson of all time, where as the chemistry teacher managed to make something explode through the ceiling. And I've never forgotten it. And I reckon that's one of the reasons why I love science so much.
Okay, thank you very much for those answers. So you had 3 minutes each at the start. We're thinking 2 minutes each at the end for you to sum up. And Ed went first at the start, so we're going to Layla first for the start of this, and then Ed will have the last word of the hustings. So Layla, about 2 minutes for a summary.
Great. Well, thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sal. Thank you, everybody. I've really enjoyed tonight's hustings. Now more than ever, we need a strong liberal vision to challenge the Conservatives and move our country forward. And we need to put students of all ages back at the heart of our education system. We need to back our teachers and let them get on and teach, but also to develop their own skills and empower them to in turn empower their students. And we need to fund education at a level that guarantees the ability to learn whether you're 3 or whether you're 63, and that also values academic and vocational learning equally. But to change our country, we have to face up to the fact that we need to change our party. We are currently 6% in the polls, and it's not good enough. Steady as she goes won't cut it anymore. We can and must do better. We need to develop a strategy, a vision and a message to grab the headlines and rebuild the party's profile. And we need to live our values too. However you may support the party, whether as a voter or donor, a campaigner or councillor, the party must work much harder to support you. Whether it's through training or mentoring, we must ensure that those who want to see our party succeed have the skills to do so. To deliver for the people in our communities, we need to be a party that starts winning elections again, so that people can see on the ground why it makes such a difference to vote Lib Dem. Because when you vote Lib Dem, you get Lib Dems. And as we've seen from the fantastic work of our Education Minister in Wales, Kirsty Williams, when you get Lib Dems get stuff done properly. We need to rebuild trust in our party. We need to reinvigorate our party, and we need a leader that voters can believe in again. I am that leader. So please, if you haven't already cast your ballot, please vote for me, and let's move forward together. Thank you.
And over to you, Ed, for the last words of the hustings.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and thanks to Sal and Kevin for chairing. Education and skills are so central to the purpose of liberalism. So I'm really delighted we've had tonight's debate. It's convinced me even more we do need that new liberal debate on education. England's system just isn't working for so many children and young people. Yes, there are many wonderful examples of success. In our zeal to improve people's lives, we mustn't fall into the trap of talking down the fantastic achievement of young people, their teachers, schools, colleges and universities. But yet no one can be happy with today's centralized constraining education system. If we want a fairer society, we must reform it and make investment in education and training our top priority. And make sure extra cash does deliver greater social justice with well-targeted policies like our flagship pupil premium that I'm very proud to have been a key part of. We need to target above all early years education with free quality childcare, and we need to champion vocational skills education too. Yet significant extra financial resource alone won't make the radical transformation we need. We do need a bolder rethink, starting with the pupils and the parents, building bottom up, so children and young people get the education that suits them, not the education some minister like Michael Gove thinks they should have. So we can focus on those children who've experienced adverse childhood experiences, from witnessing violence and abuse to growing up in a household where substance abuse and mental health problems damage the parental bond, from young carers missing out on education to looked after children struggling at school. I want our education policy to prioritize the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged. Friends, we used to be known as the party for education. We can be again. And this government's shambolic betrayal of young people and students gives us an ideal opportunity. So let's develop new radical ideas and campaign in every community so we will win again on education. Thank you.
Thanks very much, both of you. From the National Education Union, I'm really pleased to have been part with you of this hustings tonight. Good luck to both of you. We look forward from the NEU to working with the Lib Dems and to carrying on working with Sal and the Lib Dem Education Association.
And Kevin, thank you very much and the NEU for being part of this. It's a really good opportunity to come together and discuss education. Thank you to both candidates for a tremendous performance. And as Kevin said, good luck to both of you. And thank you to Claire and to Harjit for interpreting for us. And have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.